The word for this week is modernity. Modernity. I want to give you a little recap of where we've been so far. We've talked about ancient Israel way back in the fall semester. We also talked about the Roman Empire and the development of the early church. Then we've talked a lot about how the early church grew and became incorporated into society. We talked about the rise of Christendom, and we talked about the Great Schism, where the church divided east from west. Today, we're going to talk about the modern era. Now, you might be thinking about modernity and modernism as something, well, you might be thinking of modern art or mid-century modern decor, something that I actually really like. But when historians talk about modernity, they're actually talking about something that happened way before that. They're talking about somewhere in the 14 and 1500s. We're going to talk about the dawn or the rise of modernity. Modernity is a phrase that historians use to talk about a certain point in time in the development of the Western world, because remember, we're tracing the development of the Western church. And I should say, just from the outset, just to remind you that from the beginning, the Christian church has been a global tradition. There were versions of the church that developed in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, and we are tracing the development of the church as it grew in the West, which basically means the development of the church in the Middle East and up in through Europe. But really, we could be telling this story a lot of other places. But the story of modernity, for most historians, is the story of what happens as the church develops in Europe. Now, this is a really old globe, and so it's kind of out of date because, as you may or may not know, the boundaries between nations change over time. But I wanted to point out this little tiny place that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the development of the church, the early modern era of the church in this little corner of the world here in Europe. In Germany, Switzerland, a little bit in France, and eventually we'll also get to the United Kingdom. Now, this is a really tiny point on a map, and you may be thinking, why are we concentrating our efforts so hard right here in this modern era? Well, the simple reason for that is that the ideas that developed in the modern era in that little tiny corner of the world have really influenced us today. So if you are familiar with the Christian tradition, if you grew up in a church, for example, you grew up in a church probably that was directly changed or directly affected by the ideas and the practices that developed in this time and in this place. So it's a tiny place. There's a lot of other versions of Christianity going on around the world, very important versions of Christianity, but we're going to concentrate our efforts here in this tiny corner of the world. So I mentioned that modernity is this era where a bunch of things are happening all at once. I'm going to list a bunch of things that were going on that lead to us classifying this time as modern. And it can be tempting when I list them out for you to think of them as chronological or as listed in order of importance. But I want to invite you to imagine that people in the modern era were a lot like people now. They're just living their lives, experiencing a lot of big changes in the world. And to them, they're experiencing all these things all at once. So what makes the era modern if it's not like modern art? Well, the first thing I want to mention is globalization. One key component that made the modern era, this era that still shapes our thinking today, is the rise of globalization. Globalization didn't look then like it looks now. Like there weren't a bunch of airplanes traveling the world or even trains crisscrossing continents and making travel really fast. But there were ships and trade routes that were developed in the 1400s and the 1500s that made the world feel a lot smaller than it had before. And just like now, when we are able to transport ourselves or transport our voices around the world, we start encountering different people, different ideas, and it really changes how we look at things. So, for the church, for Christians who were in the 1400s and the 1500s, they were being exposed to different people, different cultures, different practices, and different religions at a rate faster than they had before. One key to increasing globalization was a rise of technology in the early modern era. There were all these inventions that were created in the 1400s and 1500s that made it easier for the world to get much smaller. One development was the creation of a finery forge that made docking technology easier, which you may think, what in the world does that have to do with anything? Well, actually, if you can create bigger, faster ships with better docking technology, you can travel the world and you can take things across the world a lot faster. So that's just one example, but probably the most famous invention and the invention that most people think of as having the biggest impact on the development of the church was the printing press. So the printing press, you may have heard this famous story of Gutenberg. The printing press was developed in the modern era, and it made Bibles and other Christian writings easier and less expensive to produce. Now, before you go thinking that it created the world as we know it today, where anytime you go to a hotel room, you can open a drawer and find a free Bible for you, Bibles weren't that inexpensive. In fact, the cost of a Bible in the early modern era was about, I think it was like 3 to 5 years of the average person's income. That's how much a Bible would cost. So Bibles were still super expensive, but much less expensive and faster to produce than they were now. I also mentioned that Christian writings were a lot less expensive to produce. And that's something that's going to come up and be a key development as we talk about the modern era. Closely linked to the development of the printing press was a rise in literacy in the early modern era. So from the very outset, the Christian church, and indeed all of ancient society, had very low literacy rates. Most historians guess that somewhere between 9 and 10% of the population could read. 9 and 10%. Well, how could they experience the Bible if they couldn't read, you might ask? Oftentimes it was read to them. It was Christians memorized them. And as we talked about in the medieval era, Christians experienced them through Christian worship and through really amazing pieces of art, like those gorgeous stained glass windows that you may see someday, if and when you get to go travel and see those gorgeous old churches of the medieval era. But in the early modern era, lots of printing, lots of printed words meant that lots more people were able to read the scriptures for themselves. Now, that is, if they could read the language that the scriptures were produced in. That's going to come up a little bit later. But for now, all you need to remember is that the early modern era was marked by a rapid increase in literacy. Another thing that happened in this era is the Renaissance. You may have heard that term before. A basic definition of the Renaissance is that it's a revival of interest in ancient Greek and Roman ideas, art, general thought. You can see this in Renaissance literature, in Renaissance art, music, and also in Renaissance thinking. Probably the most famous example of this is an artist named Leonardo da Vinci. If you compare his famous drawings and other pieces of art to ancient Roman and ancient Greek sculptures and statues that you can still see today in Greece and Rome, you will see a very a noticeable similarity between those. So early modern, European mostly, Renaissance thinkers were very interested in reviving the ideas of ancient Greece and Rome. Closely related to the Renaissance is the rise of something that we call humanism. Now, a basic definition of humanism is a love of logic and reason and an appreciation for the human capacity and enterprise. The famous Catholic theologian and scholar Thomas Aquinas anticipated this in the medieval era when he got really into the philosophy and thought of ancient Greeks and Romans that actually came to him, again, through those trade routes, through interactions with Muslims. And Thomas Aquinas, and then many other future thinkers, including a couple that we're going to talk about today in the early modern era, were shaped by this idea, this embrace of human logic and reason. You may have heard the term humanism paired with another term, which is secular humanism. You may have heard that that is not a good thing. I want to make sure and be clear. The idea of humanism doesn't necessarily mean that it is detached. And in fact, in the early modern era, it would not have been detached from Christianity. Indeed, Christians in the early modern era who called themselves humanists, the vast majority of them were also devout Christians. They believed that God had given them this love of logic and reason, and had the idea that they were having these thoughts and doing this kind of reasoning was evidence of the existence of God and the image of God in them. So humanism is not a secular category. In fact, if you've heard those two things, secular humanism, put together, you can see that in terms of, like, historically speaking, you'd need to put secular on there because most of the humanists in the early modern, especially in the Western world, were Christians. Another thing that happened in the early modern era was a rise of nationalism. Even as Europeans were becoming more global, they were traveling all over the world, they started thinking of themselves more and more in terms of their national identity. Now, this may seem like a given. Like, if you look at this globe here, this fancy old globe, you will see that all of these different colors on the globe, and that's meant to tell you that this is one country and this is another country. And it may just, in your mind, go without saying that one of the primary markers of yourself, your identity, is related to your nation. Well, that hasn't always been the case. In fact, if you think back to the stories of the ancient Israelites, a lot of times people thought of themselves in terms of tribal identity first. Like, they may be from the tribe of Judah, or they may be from the tribe of Levi, maybe even above or even sometimes against their identity as a nation. But in the early modern era, Europeans in particular started thinking about themselves in terms of national identity. Now, that is also a departure from their more recent history when we talked about the rise of Christendom. Europeans began thinking of themselves potentially as belonging to a particular country even before they belonged to Christendom, or this trans-European Christian authority source. That is a really big change, and that is going to come up again and again. Another key development in the early modern era was the development of something called colonialism. Now, colonialism is a really big idea. It's sort of like talking about nationalism. So we could talk about this for a long time, and then actually there are like entire books and series and classes that talk all about colonialism. But a really brief definition of colonialism is it's basically European nations creating miniature versions of themselves around the world to increase their wealth and increase their cultural capital. So if you're living in the United States, and most of you are, you may or may not know that you are living in what was a European colony. What was called the New World. It wasn't new to everyone, just the Europeans. The people who came here, they were a part of this global, in some ways, a global arms race. European countries were going all over the world, mining the world for resources, natural resources, and also human resources. You might be thinking to yourself, human resources? Yes, one of the major, most profitable forms of resources that colonizers used was human resources in the form of slavery. The practice of slavery, of stealing people from other nations or other parts of the world and enslaving them and using their free labor, is one of the great theological crises of the early modern era, and all for many hundreds of years, and we live with that legacy today. Colonialism was a very complex endeavor, but that's one of the theological crises that comes up again and again and again, because it really asks the question, what does it mean to be human? It's kind of an interesting time to think about that, the early modern era, because modern people, on the one hand, many of them were celebrating all of these gifts that God had given human beings. This ability to create beautiful art, this ability to reason, this ability to think big thoughts and accomplish amazing things and create technology, all the while using other people from other parts of the world for their economic benefit. That is a big crisis. Who is a human? What counts as a human? That's a question that for Christians in any age to ask. For Christians in our era, we need to think right back to that colonial past to really understand the question as it is in front of us today. All of these changes made the world simultaneously much bigger than it had ever been before and much smaller than it had ever been before. And it presented a lot of really important questions that Christians needed to answer. We're going to go back to that tiny little spot in Europe, and we're going to think through three major responses that come to us from the nations of Germany and Switzerland. In the middle of the modern era, one important Catholic thinker was thinking some pretty big, pretty radical thoughts. He argued that clergy were not supposed to be this somewhere off in an ivory tower thinking fancy theological thoughts and performing the sacraments for each other. No, they ought to be educators out there with the common folk and teaching them things, really important things about the Christian life. He also argued that the sacraments were important, and remember how important they are from the last lectures, but he said actually what's more important are spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices. He also argued that believers ought to be able to have access to the Bible in their own common language. Who am I talking about? That's right, Desiderius Erasmus. What? Are you surprised? If you've done the reading for this week, you probably thought I was going to say Martin Luther. Actually, Erasmus was a really important thinker, a Dutch thinker who preceded Martin Luther, and he had a lot of the same ideas, influenced Martin Luther. He was never excommunicated from the church like Martin Luther was. Spoiler alert, we're going to get to that in just a second. But I just wanted to bring up Erasmus to let you know that there were a lot of people having a lot of the same ideas in the early modern era. There was something about medieval thought and scholasticism, that really complex mode of engaging with God intellectually, that wasn't really satisfying for people in the modern era. And there were some key church leaders, Erasmus being one of them, and of course Martin Luther being another, and a couple other that we're going to talk about today, that sensed a need and developed some ideas about thought and practice that would meet the needs of the church in this modern era. The reading you've done for this week talks about a critical moment in the development of the church, particularly the Western church, the Protestant Reformation. There were Christian thinkers, most of whom started out as Roman Catholic thinkers, who wanted to reform the church. People like Martin Luther, for example, who believed that the church had gotten a bunch of things wrong, in the case of Martin Luther, 95 plus, things wrong, and they wanted to see the church change. Now, some people decided to stay in communion in the church, Erasmus being one of those, and work within. Others, like Luther, wanted to stay, but were kicked out. And then there were some who left on their own. So we're going to talk about three important people, but we're going to talk about many more in future weeks. And there's so many that we're missing. So this was a really exciting time. Lots of different things were happening. Lots of important thinkers and actors to be studied. But today we're talking about three, and we're talking about three who were what we call magisterial reformers. The magisterial reforms, that basically, it's a fancy word that basically means reforms that were supported by local government. So if you are talking about a magistrate in the early modern era, you're basically talking about city leaders, government people. The first magisterial reformer that most people know about is, of course, Martin Luther. You're reading a lot about Martin Luther this week, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about him, although we could, mostly because he spent a ton of time talking about himself as well. So there's lots of written evidence about Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a character, to say the least. In fact, if you ever really want to insult somebody in a fun way, I highly recommend Googling Martin Luther insult generator. He wrote tons of very not safe for work, not safe for class, even insults. So if you want to entertain yourself, highly recommend. But anyway, back to it. Martin Luther was a trained lawyer and an Augustinian. That was his theological bent. So he would have had a lot in common theologically with the ancient thinker Augustine. Martin Luther's big doctrine, the one that you probably have heard of before if you know anything about the development of Christianity, was justification by faith. This idea of justification by faith completely had the potential to completely upend the way that the church in the West was done. The penitential system had to go. The ways that the church organized itself potentially had to go. And so Luther met with a lot of resistance. He's also very famous for the three solas. You may have heard of these before. Sola scriptura, scripture alone; sola fides, faith alone; and sola gratia, grace alone. You may be thinking to yourself, which one is it alone? There's only supposed to be one. He wasn't a systematic theologian, so don't think about it too hard. But Luther, his ideas were so radical that he met a lot of resistance from basically his higher-ups. Now, he was a brilliant guy, and as a trained lawyer, he was excellent at making his case. He himself wanted to stay within the Roman Catholic Church, but he argued himself in many ways into a corner, and so he was excommunicated. Now, what happened then? Well, in another era, Luther, his writings were banned by the Roman Catholic Church. And in another era, that may have been the end of it. Basically, it was over. But this was the early modern era. And the idea of Martin Luther's writings being collected, burned, and banned, that just didn't hold any water in the early modern era, because remember the printing press? That would have been impossible. And also, remember the rise of nationalism. Martin Luther was not alone in this. He was a German, and there were other German princes who saw his way of things and protected him. So Luther's ideas and his practices and theologies were saved and preserved, and in fact became one of the major religious movements in Western Europe and the church of his homeland, Germany. Another important magisterial reformer was a man by the name of Ulrich Zwingli. Now, Zwingli was a Swiss man, and he convinced the city leaders in his hometown of Zurich to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. I like to think of Zwingli as a reformer's reformer. He wanted to go in some ways farther away from the teachings of Roman Catholicism than Martin Luther did. For example, one of Zwingli's big ideas, and an idea that has really shaped the church, especially in the US today, is the idea that the act of communion, or the Eucharist, is symbolic only. So in many, if not most, American churches, the idea of taking communion or receiving baptism is taught about in this way, that it is an outward expression of an inward spiritual reality. An outward expression of an inward spiritual reality. The idea of talking about the sacraments in that way comes to us from Zwingli. So Zwingli didn't believe that there was anything in the real presence of God was in the sacrament of communion. He believed instead that there was something spiritual happening in the life of the believer. That is a radical change, because then it lets you question who can give the sacraments and what those sacraments actually mean. So Martin Luther is like the lawyer of the magisterial reforms. And I think of Zwingli as the radical of the magisterial reforms. And now I want to talk about someone who I like to think of as the architect, John Calvin. John, or Jean, as you might call him, was a French man who actually traveled a lot over the course of his life. And he really found a home in Geneva, in Switzerland. So something about the Swiss and German reforms. There's a lot of stuff going on in those little parts of Europe at this time. But John Calvin was a very, very orderly and systematic thinker. I think of him as the height of modern thinking. He had a deep desire to understand God in an orderly, systematic, and very reasonable way. John Calvin was a prolific writer. He didn't write as much about himself. Didn't have the same kind of cranky personality that Martin Luther had, but he was an extraordinary thinker. His most famous writing, Institutes of the Christian Religion, is a modern masterpiece. It is reasonable, it is orderly, and it emphasizes the sovereignty of God above all else. In fact, Calvin argues that human freedom is only truly found in a sovereign God. Now, people have riffed on Calvin many times and in many ways over the years. In fact, he's one of the most important theologians, especially for Christians here in the United States. In fact, Calvin and Calvinism, the theology that was created around Calvin's original thoughts, have enjoyed something of a renaissance here in the States. In fact, there are some congregations who call themselves neo-Calvinists, new Calvinists, because they see their ideas about theology as bringing Calvin into the 21st century. So if you've heard of him and his ideas, that could be why. The magisterial reforms, they depended on one really important thing: support from local government. It wasn't going to work without it. So Luther needed the German princes to back him. Calvin needed the government in Geneva, and Zwingli needed the government in Zurich. But those were not the only reforms and renewal movements going on in the early modern era. In fact, in the subsequent weeks, we're going to be talking about what other Christians did in other parts of the Western Church. So we'll be talking about Christians in England, we'll be talking about Christians in Spain, in Portugal, and in many other nations, Christians wrestling with what it means to be a faithful follower of God in the modern world. Now, the modern world may seem distant to you, but I would guess that it seems a little closer than some of the other eras that we've talked about, in large part because we still live with a lot of these big ideas. We tend to think of ourselves as a people according to our nation. We tend to think of ourselves also as individuals. That's kind of an idea that comes to us from the development of humanism. And we tend to think of ourselves as, most students who come to George Fox are Protestant. We still have, I think, about an increasing number of Roman Catholic students. Don't worry, Roman Catholic students, you will get some Roman Catholics here in the next few weeks, because Catholics were also wrestling with how to be Christian in the modern world. Hopefully you've gotten some ideas from the early modern era that will help you think through what it means to be a Christian now. Some people say that we're past modernity, that we're in post-modernity. I'm not sure that that's true. I think that we're still living with a lot of those big ideas, and they've changed over time, but we can learn a lot from the theologians and the devout Christians of the early modern era about how to be faithful right now.